Hello, my name is Casey Burns, and this semester I have been conducting research geared towards understanding the trials and tribulations faced by female stand-up comedians in the male-dominated industry of stand-up comedy. Now, through my research, I've learned that female stand-up comedians can be defined as women who engage in the act of stand-up comedy. Now, these can be both women of transgendered or cisgendered origins who identify as any socioeconomic status, race, ethnicity, nationality. As long as they identify as a woman and they engage in stand-up comedy, they may be considered as part of this group. Now, stand-up comedy in this circumstance refers to comedy that draws upon the experiences of one's own self rather than the experiences of, say, a character. And through these experiences is how they deliver their punchlines. Now, through my literature review, I've learned that female stand-up comedians are often perceived to be a threat to the patriarchal order. And this is most relevant when through their stand-up material, they are not engaging in techniques such as self-deprecation. Now, self-deprecation is often considered to be beneficial to female stand-up comedians' routines by male audience members and audience members at large. This is mostly because it relies on the female stand-up comedian deprecating herself, which adds towards the patriarchal idea that men are better than women, or that women are less than men. Women are also assumed to lack a natural aggression that is needed for stand-up comedy, and this goes back to general societal expectations of women that they are delicate and that they are fragile and more calm than men, more weak than men. These translate as well into the scene of stand-up comedy. However, when women do become aggressive through their routines, they may often face backlash, and therefore female stand-up comedians do fear making controversial statements in fear of facing backlash from their audience members. Now, a lot of these sort of factors put female stand-up comedians in a tricky position because they don't feel like they can succeed in their work without gearing towards patriarchal standards. This is most so assisted by representation of women in the media that are female stand-up comedians and do not cater towards patriarchal perspectives or opinions of how their work should be executed. Now, through this research, I landed on two separate research questions. The first of which is, in what ways do the opinions of female audience members reflect an agreeance or disagreeance to patriarchal preferences? And I landed on this question because a lot of the conventions that are associated with stand-up comedy, particularly in the subject of female stand-up comedy, rely on the audience's perceptions. And as audiences do agree with comedy that is self-deprecating for women and most sort of geared towards a patriarchal bias, it can be assumed that female stand-up comedian audience members are also sharing these kind of patriarchal ideas. And they are also uplifting them through their approval of female stand-up comedians' routines that most so geared towards self-deprecation. The second of these questions is, how may female stand-up comedians be successful while rejecting patriarchal norms? Now, this is something that I wanted to explore through further research, and in the upcoming media analysis, this will be somewhat answered. So I conducted a media analysis on The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, and in using a qualitative analysis to examine this show, I landed on these segments of dialogue. Now, what's important to keep in mind during this segment is that the character of Sophie is a female stand-up comedian who is secretly a female comedic actress. She pretends to be this sort of eccentric woman from New Jersey that is full of stereotypes that are geared towards the patriarchal bias. Now, Miriam draws upon her own real life experiences as a female stand-up comedian, which does allow her to serve as a female stand-up comedian and put Sophie in the position of a female comedic actress, which, as mentioned before, are two very different territories, because when a woman is acting as a comedic actress, she is performing a character that is dissociated from herself and does not represent her true emotions and her true perspective. Now, Miriam, on the other hand, does perform with an attention to her own perspective and her own experiences, which is frowned down upon by the patriarchal bias because it allows women to have more of a voice and more of a control over how they choose to present themselves. So in a conversation between these two women about stand-up comedy, Sophie asked Miriam, "What is your gimmick, your persona?" To which Miriam responds, I don't have a persona, I'm just me. And Sophie responds to this by saying, that will not work, they want a character. Now, this segment of dialogue emphasizes what Giles and Associates mentioned on page 93 of the Dynamics of Intergroup Communication. Now, they talked about how stereotypes provide a normative frame of reference for behavior and how they imbue social information with clarity and meaning. Both of these events are occurring in this conversation right here. So Sophie is supporting a normative frame of reference for behavior, the frame of reference that in order to succeed as a comedian, females must adapt a character rather than present them themselves. Now, the social information that she's translating through this is also related to that sentiment that in order for a female stand-up comedian to succeed in the industry, she needs to change and abandon her own pride and her own sense of self. Now, Miriam, through her neglectance to adapt persona, is in a way deflecting from these patriarchal standards, and she is rejecting them actively. And this can be further explored in the quantitative analysis of the humor represented in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. So in The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, the specific episode, we are presented to two separate comedy routines, Sophie's and Miriam's. And in Sophie's comedic routine, she made 8 jokes about herself and no jokes about other people. Meanwhile, in Miriam's comedic routine, she only makes 2 jokes about herself and 13 jokes about other people. Now, in referencing the stereotypes that are described in the Dynamics of Intergroup Communication by Giles and Associates on page 93, they also mentioned that stereotypes or arguments over stereotypes often affect intergroup relations in both positive and negative ways. Now, Sophie in this show is a successful comedian, and she has gotten a lot of approval from audience members, both male and female. And a lot of the reasons why she has gained such an attention and appreciation is because she gears herself towards the patriarchal preferences of stand-up comedy. And this can be reflected in her comedic material, as 8 of her jokes were about herself. And this is most so indicating a sense of self-deprecation. Miriam's comedic material, however, shows less of a sense of self-deprecation and more so deprecation towards other people and insulting other people. Now, Miriam, in the context of the show, is a struggling stand-up comedian. She has not yet gained success like Sophie has, and that is reflected by her comedic material, as her material is not in agreement with patriarchal standards and is more so in agreement with her own sense of self and her own self-confidence. So the conclusion that I have made from this research is that female stand-up comedians are, as mentioned, actively oppressed by patriarchal standards. Their success is often dependent on their ability to cater towards stereotypes and use techniques that are supported by the patriarchy, such as self-deprecation. Now, the opinions of audience members may either support or oppose this patriarchal bias, although in most occasions they tend to support the bias. Representation is also key in motivating female stand-up comedians to pursue their careers. And because of this fact, it is important for audiences to support female stand-up comedians who do not gear themselves towards patriarchal biases or patriarchal opinions of what is considered to be funny and unfunny. And by consuming media that is more so geared towards a progressive state of mind rather than the previous patriarchal state of mind, female stand-up comedians may succeed in the industry by staying true to themselves rather than staying true to what the patriarchy expects of them. These are my references, and I thank you very much.